In this video, I'm going to talk about search engine optimization and, to some extent, the role of analytics and how that connects with it. In particular, I'm going to talk about how search engines understand your content and how you can make it easier for them to understand what it's about, some techniques for improving the findability of that, and some bad practice in search engine optimization to avoid and why you should avoid that. And I want to start by looking at headlines, generally print headlines, and the rich history that we have, particularly in the UK, around the legendary headlines. Here are just some that have become very famous in UK journalism circles. Some of them because of their succinctness. So the headline "Gotcha" around the sinking of a ship during the Falklands War is a classic example of really being very simple and short and punchy in headline writing. So these are very famous headlines, and because of the value that's attached to the headline in UK publishing, search engine optimization has sometimes been frowned upon or resisted or bemoaned because of the fact that it represents a shift away from this, if you like, quite creative approach to headline writing to what sometimes is seen as an overly literal approach. A couple of points to make about this. First of all, this style of headline writing is actually relatively recent. It's only been around since the 60s. And the second is that this style of writing obviously still continues. What we're dealing with as headline writers are a number of different contexts. The print headline is written for a newsstand or newsagent context where someone is browsing through different papers. You can also get headlines written for signs outside newsagents as well. So you can see an example there in the middle of the picture. And then we have a very different context when people are consuming stories online. So we need to write headlines that work in the context in which they're consumed. In this slide, you can see the same story and the three different headlines that have been used to tell that story. The print headline at the bottom is punny. It's quite short because there's limited space, and it doesn't necessarily need you to know the context of who Young is. It assumes you've already bought the paper or you know who that is. The middle example, obviously, is it designed to be driven past or walked past. And then the top example is an online headline where we've got the full name of Carson Young, the full name of Karen Brady, and a bit more detail for two reasons. Firstly, because there's not the same limitations of space that we have in print. And secondly, because we need search engines to properly understand what the story is about, and also people who are searching for these terms. Now, the writing of headlines used to be a separate job for journalists. It used to be done by someone other than the reporter. But it's very common these days for reporters to not only be expected to write the story, but also write a headline that will work on search engines, to include some visuals as well, so some sort of photo, and also other elements like a tweet or a Facebook update that can go with it. So it is important to develop these skills in a way that hasn't been the case in the past. One way that you can make sure that your headline is relevant to what people are searching for is to use a tool like Google Trends. Google Trends allows you to test different terms against each other and find out how many people are searching for those different terms in relative terms. So in this example, I've typed in three different possible terms related to the eruption of a volcano in Japan. Let's say I'm writing a story about that eruption and I want to know whether to use the phrase Japanese volcano or volcano in Japan, or whether I should use the specific name of that volcano, in this case Mount Ontake. Google Trends tells me that people in the UK are searching more for the term Japan volcano than they're searching for the specific name of the volcano. And that's really helpful to me as a writer because it means I can understand the language that my audience is using, and I can use the language that connects with them that is most understandable. So I will use Japan volcano rather than the specific name of the volcano in the headline. Now, this understanding of search behaviour has led to some new headlines and new stories. We now increasingly and quite regularly see stories like this about which actually sound like a search engine query. Why are new speed limit signs being covered up in Bristol Road? Or what time is The Apprentice on tonight? Or things like that. And this is quite an interesting example of how our journalism is being shaped by a changed understanding of our audiences and changing ways in which our journalism is found and shared. Some people might find this a little bit depressing. They might be quite negative about that. They might think, actually, why are we reporting stories like this when previously we might have reported something else? David Higgerson at Reach, which is a regional publisher of newspapers and news websites, makes a very strong point that actually it is really important that we understand what's important to our readers. So if we find through our use of things like Google Trends that readers are searching for something in particular, then we should be aware of that and the importance of that to our readers. And vice versa, if we think that something is important, we need to understand these techniques to be able to make it important and relevant to our readers too. If they can't find our journalism, then we are not doing our job in making it important to them. And it's worth clicking on the link in this slide to read that article in full. I want to move on now to some of the jargon involved in search engine optimization. First of all, of course, SEO is the acronym for search engine optimization. But there are some other terms as well that are useful to understand and be familiar with. For example, the term hit in the past has been used and misused indeed, because hit tended to mean every item on a page that was loaded. So every image was a different hit, the piece of HTML or a video. So a single page could represent a number of different hits as different parts of that page were loaded. Now that practice is not as common now, but it's still worth being aware of. A better term to use is page views or visits. The number of page views is how many pages have been viewed on a particular website, or indeed how many times a single page has been viewed or visited. Bounce rate is a term that means the proportion of visitors to a website who leave after one page, or indeed the proportion of visitors to a web page who do not continue through the site afterwards. Generally speaking, we always want our bounce rate to be as low as possible. In other words, we want as many people as possible to be staying on our site after the first page that they read. So when they've read one article, we want them to read another one, or we want them to do something else on the site. And quite often, a lot of the management of news websites is involved in finding ways to reduce that bounce rate and keep people on the site. And then there's the term engagement. Engagement is a broad term which refers to different metrics beyond simple page views that measure how someone interacts with the content on our website. So, for example, how much time they spend on a page, not just whether they visited it or not. Whether they took some sort of action, such as commenting or sharing the story that they've read. And increasingly, engagement is seen as much more important than those very basic measurements of page visits and page views. Advertisers want to know that readers are particularly engaged with stories. On this slide, you can see an example of a view in Google Analytics where you can see the bounce rate and conversion rate for different visitors to a web page or website. A goal conversion rate is where you might set a goal such as people subscribing to your site, or people subscribing to an email newsletter, or clicking through to an advert. And that's something else you might measure using analytics tools like Google Analytics. Equally, in a different view on Google Analytics, we have measurements of how long people spent on a particular page and how many page views there were. Other analytics tools like Chartbeat can provide other analytics details. They can tell us where people have come from, how many have shared, and other details that might be relevant to what we're interested in. Now, Chartbeat tends to focus on live data rather than historical data as well. I want to move on now then to Google in particular and the algorithms that it uses to rank our journalism, our content. Sometimes these algorithms are given particular names like the panda algorithm and the penguin algorithm. And this is about how they rank your content on their search engine results page, what's sometimes called the SERP. And broadly speaking, we're interested in two qualities: the relevance of your page, of your story, to the search terms that someone is using, and the importance of your website and your web page. Now, when it comes to relevance, the search engine will also try to understand the intent of the searcher. So, for example, if someone searches for Birmingham, they might be searching for Birmingham as a travel destination, or they might be searching for Birmingham in terms of directions. And their previous search history would give Google some sort of indication as to what they might be interested in. So, for example, if they've searched for other cities or they've searched for holidays, then Google might guess that their intent is around holidays. And if your story is about things to do in Birmingham, then they might include that in the search results. But if someone has been searching for directions to Birmingham beforehand, or particular places in Birmingham, then your article about things to see in Birmingham might not be relevant from Google's point of view. So in understanding how search engines rank your content is really helpful in making sure that you write it and edit it in a way that's going to make it findable. Now, I would say there's broadly three levels of search engine optimization, three things to consider, three types of things to consider when it comes to making your content findable. And the first is the actual content itself, the text in your article. Now, that's weighted in different ways. Some content is more important than others when it comes to search engines. Headlines, for example, are obviously going to be more important in giving an indication of what your article is about. Likewise, subheadings should be chosen carefully for the same reasons. Any bold or italic text, anything that's emphasized in some way, will also have slightly more weight than text that isn't. Links, tables, and lists are also important, and where content comes in an article as well. So the first paragraph of a story is going to be given more weight by Google in terms of understanding what the story is about than the very last one. For that reason, it's important to get keywords in your story early on and in headlines and subheadings. There have been some attempts to try to understand which aspects of an article are more important than others by trying to reverse engineer the algorithm of Google and Google News. But ultimately, we don't really know. Google obviously keeps this secret because it does not want to be manipulated. What you will have in the news industry because of this is often instructions on making sure that your stories are headlined or titled or introduced with certain keywords in them. This is an email that was sent around one particular news organisation following the death of Robin Williams, and it talks about making sure that the stories start with the full name of the person involved and keywords like death, dead, and suicide, etc. It's quite a dark email and also an insight into how, if you like, coldly sometimes we deal with quite significant and emotional events. Now, this is an example of a headline that was written for Birmingham East Side where it needed to be changed for search engine optimization purposes. And I want you to look at this and just have a think about what you would change about it to address some of these issues that we've talked about. So what is the problem with this headline? I'll give you a moment to think about it. Okay, so probably the main problem here is if you imagine this in some search engine results, it doesn't actually mention which city council we're talking about. And this is a common problem with writing, particularly in local news reporting. You might assume that your audience is a local audience and knows which city council you're talking about. But when you're writing online, your audience could come from anywhere. So whereas in a print newspaper, you could assume that only people in Birmingham are going to get that newspaper, in this case, we can't. And also, Birmingham is a keyword that we want in there, so Google understands what this relates to. Here's another example. Again, I'd like you to look at this headline and the intro and think about what might be the problems here and how you might change that content. So again, the problem here is we're using a word that isn't very understandable as being the person involved. So instead of Jose Mourinho, we've got Moo. Now, we can't guarantee that search engines will know what Moo is, or indeed that people will be searching for Moo. People are more likely to be searching for Jose Mourinho and Aston Villa. So a simple change here is quite important. Now notice in the article itself that Jose Mourinho is not mentioned in the first paragraph, instead Tim Sherwood is and Aston Villa is. So we might also change that intro to make sure that Jose Mourinho is mentioned there. Now, if we go back to this story, you'll notice that originally Jose Mourinho was not actually named in any of the first 3 paragraphs, whereas one of the changes made here is that we do at least name him in the second, and we make his name bold just to again, kind of emphasize it a little bit more, as well as other names. Level 2 of search engine optimization refers to the invisible content, the code that's underpinning the page. That includes things like the URL, the title of the page, which is what appears across the bar in the browser, properties of images such as the alt tags and captions around them, metadata like tags and categories, and also some context to the story, like how recently it was published, where it was published, and whether it's optimized for mobile and loads quickly. Here is an example of the distinction between invisible and visible content. At the top you can see the URL for this story in the Express News website, which is simply a list of keywords: Ian Watters, Baked Alaska, Great British Bake Off. So the URL is essentially a list of the keywords that this story refers to. And that's quite common in writing, to edit the URL and make sure that it covers all the keywords that might be relevant to people's searches. However, by some accident or because they rushed this out too quickly, the headline is also that same list of keywords. Perhaps in order to get it into the URL, you need to type the keywords as a headline first and then change it after, and they forgot to change it. As a headline, obviously this doesn't work, it doesn't make sense, it's just a list of nouns, there's no verbs, there's nothing else here. And this story was very quickly changed to fix that problem. But it's a good illustration of the fact that visible content has to be readable to humans, make sense, make them want to click through, because people clicking through to articles is one of the factors that search engines are going to use in ranking it. If lots of people click on a link in the search engine results, then that link may rise up the search results because Google will judge that it is more relevant. But the URL is a piece of invisible content that doesn't need to be readable to humans. Images are particularly important and another area that's often overlooked. This was an image of a quote from a story. Now, what you see might be the image, but what search engines see is the alt tag underpinning it, primarily. So in this case, the alt tag is simply "law students talk legal aid." Well, this is problematic on a number of levels. First of all, alt tags are designed to describe the image for blind users. So a blind user doesn't actually know what this quote says. It will not read the quote properly to them. So really that alt tag should have the full quote in there in order that a blind user is not being discriminated against. And search engines are the biggest blind users of the web. So you need to make sure that they can read it as well and understand it. Now, having said that, in recent years, Google in particular has been using AI to actually try to read images and understand the words in them. And in fact, you can use Google image search to search images based on the text in them. So you can search for license plates, for example. But the broad principle is still really important. You need to make sure that your alt tag and other tags related to the image help search engines to understand what the image is of, and also ensure that blind users understand it as well. It's worth pointing out that Google image search is one of the biggest search engines in the world. It's bigger than Bing, it's bigger than Yahoo. More searches are conducted there than almost any other search engine apart from Google itself. Another piece of invisible content is the meta description of a page. You may or may not have the ability to edit this, but if you do, then this is a description that often appears underneath the title of the article on search engine results. And you can see a couple of examples here where this has not been edited, and so the search engine results look a little bit wrong, and they don't help the reader to understand what the story is about. Another piece of invisible data is the structure of the article. The use of structured data in articles, in other words, a web table or a list, actually can increase traffic quite significantly. So in one case, a website had recipes and decided to change those web pages so that that information was structured, and that had a massive impact on the traffic to their recipes. It meant it was easy for search engines to understand. And you may have noticed yourself, if you search for something on Google and there's a list on the destination page, that list will be pulled into the search results, and you can actually see the list in the search results themselves. Hopefully that would encourage people to click through to the article, and certainly there does seem to be evidence that it does. Another thing to consider is if your website is optimized for mobile as well. If someone is searching on a mobile phone, then one of the factors that Google will use to rank the results is whether the results are themselves optimized for mobile phone. And pretty much the majority of search now takes place on mobile phones. The third level after code and content is reputation. And this is the most difficult level for you to affect as a journalist, and also the most important one. And that's probably how it should be. Reputation is judged by Google and other search engines based on a number of factors. Most importantly, the number of links that go to your page, what are called inbound links. Now, what's not counted here are what are called no-follow links. So any links posted in comments or forums are automatically added with a no-follow tag, which tells search engines not to follow those tags, those links, and not to count them as an inbound link. So you can't use that as a way to increase the number of links to your page. But genuine links to your site are a big factor in how Google judges the reputation of your page. The text around the links that link to your page is also important, because Google will use that to judge what your content is actually about. So again, if someone links to your content saying this is a great travel guide to Birmingham, then Google is going to understand the nature of your content based on that text, even if your article itself doesn't mention those words. There are some other factors as well, particularly around page rank and frequency, that I want to talk about in a bit more depth. For example, frequency, the more frequently you post, is known to affect the ranking of content. And this makes sense. If you post a lot of stories about basketball, then Google is going to judge that you are more of an authority, you have a better reputation when it comes to basketball journalism than a journalist who's only written one article in the last 5 years. Page rank is basically a name for the way in which your content is ranked by Google, and it's named after Larry Page of Google rather than pages on a website. Different websites will have different page ranks from 0 to 10, and it's a exponential rank, so it's much harder to get to rank 10 than it is to get to rank 5, and each step up is quite a big step. Relatively few sites have a page rank of 10, not surprisingly. Google itself has a page rank of 10, and the higher the page rank of the site that's linking to you, then the better it is. So if you have the BBC linking to your story, then Google is going to give more weight to that and give you more reputation than if a small independent blogger does who's only been writing for 6 months and only has a page rank of 1, for example. Now, it takes time to build up page rank. One of the things essentially that page rank shows is how long you've been around, because it takes time to accumulate links, to demonstrate frequency and authority, and so on. And the page rank of your site is another factor in how your content is ranked. So again, it will take time to build that up, and you need to be persistent. In terms of frequency, this applies, there's a couple of illustrations here of how, for example, the Daily Mail uses this principle. At one point, it had 331,000 articles about Rihanna, which was much more than it had about the Queen. Now, the Daily Mail is known for its focus on the royals, so this might sound surprising, but again, it's a good illustration of how it's adapted its reporting for the web and what its audience is actually interested in. Stories about Lady Gaga, there are actually almost as many as 4 different members of the royal family combined. And this applies to individual events as well. When there was a particularly dramatic episode of the Great British Bake Off, the Daily Mail didn't just publish 1 story, but 3 different stories within a few hours of that particular episode coming off air. Essentially what they were doing here is sending a signal to Google that we are the authority on this story, and indeed Bake Off more generally. So you should rank us more highly if someone's interested in finding out about this story. There are some bad practices in search engine optimization known as black hat SEO, and these are penalized. So if you ever hear about any of these, it's worth basically not doing them. Link spamming, for example, is a term that refers to putting links to your content around the web or paying someone else to do that for you. These links are commonly posted in places like the comments of blog articles or in forums, basically anywhere where you can post links without anyone moderating what you're doing. There's a couple of problems with this. First of all, it simply doesn't work because those sites tend to add that nofollow tag that I mentioned, which means that search engines don't count them anyway. But also it's just bad practice. You're just spamming the web, different parts of the web with your links. A similar practice is what's called link farms. A link farm is where a number of people agree to link to each other from their websites, so they all benefit from the boost in SEO. Search engines now, for a long time, have been able to detect this practice, and they will penalize you if that happens. Invisible text is where text is made invisible to humans by, for example, making it white text against a white background, but search engines would still be able to see that text. Again, this is frowned upon and penalized. And finally, what's called keyword stuffing, where you stuff your content full of particular keywords in order to try and get it ranked more highly. The content is not particularly readable to humans, but it is aimed at search engines. And again, this is broadly penalized by search engines. Partly also it's not very effective because one of the factors search engines are going to look at is how long people spend reading an article, how much they share it, how much they click through to it. And Google now has an enormous amount of information on that sort of behavior, because not only can it measure how many people click through to articles on its website, but also because Google Analytics is so widely used, it can use its Google Analytics to understand people's behavior around content and around links to content. So the key points to round up from this video are that, first of all, it's worth seeing SEO as 3 different levels. The first is content. This is what you can affect most as a journalist. You control the headline, the intro, subheadings, images, and so on. The second level is code, and you might have limited effect on this. You may well be able to change the alt tags and images, and that's certainly one of the main areas you should be concerned with, but you might not be able to change the title or the URL or the meta description. But if you can, pay some attention to those. And then the final level is the one that you have least control over and that is most important, the context in which your content exists. So the website that it sits on, who's linking to it, who shares it, and so on. You need to make it easy for search engines to understand your content. So that means not being punny in headlines, making sure that it's clear what the story is about and what images are of. And finally, this takes time. You cannot make a massively successful SEO website overnight. It does take time you have to be persistent, to build up things like PageRank, and it's helpful to be engaged as well, to interact with people online and build the links and the relationships that leads to that improved relationship. To find out more about these concepts, you can follow my bookmarks on Pinboard for SEO, and also for analytics. The links there are more broadly about how to judge the performance of content. And you'll find links and reading on Moodle as well.